Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Break from the Bench and Lunch and Learn series. Today's discussion is what judges need to know about domestic child sex trafficking, domestic violence, and the missing and murdered crisis. We would like to take a minute to thank our funders, the Department of Justice, Office of Violence Against Women. Please note that the opinions, findings, conclusions, and recommendations expressed in this publication program are those of the authors and not necessarily reflecting the views of the U.S. Department of Justice. My name is Linnell Hartway. I'm with the National Council of Juvenile and Family Court Judges, and I will be your host. English closed captioning is available for today's presentation. To view these, click on the closed captioning icon located at the bottom of your screen. Once you click this icon, you will be given a choice to view the captions at either a full transcript or as subtitles. If you need to adjust the size of your closed captions, you can access the settings by clicking the arrow next to the Start/Stop video and choosing Video Settings. From here, navigate to the Accessibility tab and where you can adjust the font size. During today's presentation, should you have any questions, please feel free to use the chat feature. We will address as many of your questions as possible. If we are not able to address your questions during today's time, we will be sure to follow up after today's discussions. If you are experiencing any technology issues, please reach out to Jenny Talencon directly through chat, and she will work with you as quickly as possible to resolve your issues. Thank you again for joining us, and we're going to begin today's session. We are joined today by the Honorable Judge John Romero. He's a retired judge who served as district court judge in the Children's Court Division of the 2nd Judicial District in Albuquerque, New Mexico. Judge Romero is past president of the National Council of Juvenile and Family Court Judges and is also a joint member of NCJ, FCJ, and the National American Indian Court Judges Association. Judge Romero has also served as lead faculty of the Council's National Institute on Domestic Child Sex Trafficking. Also joining us is Justice Ann McKee. Justice McKee was appointed to the Minnesota Supreme Court in 2016. A descendant of the White Earth Nation, she is the first American Indian to sit on the state's highest court. Prior to that, she served as the presiding judge in family courts in the 4th Judicial District in Hennepin County, Minneapolis, Minnesota. She's on national committees addressing domestic violence, child abuse, and diversity in the council and speaks frequently on the missing and murdered crisis. So thank you both for joining us today. And we will start off with our first question, which is, how do you think domestic child sex trafficking dynamics and domestic violence dynamics are alike, and how are they different?
I'll be happy to go first. I think that there are a lot of similarities, and there are obviously some distinct differences. I think that some of the, focusing first on the survivors of domestic child sex trafficking, it's not unusual that those survivors, for any number of reasons, beginning in early childhood to even their adolescent years, and synonymous with victims of domestic violence and sexual violence, tend not to have a very high esteem, high self-esteem. They feel like they're lesser than, and that very often is with the help of those who exploit them and those who are their perpetrators. There's very often, for the young lady, young man, because boys get trafficked too and men get victimized by in the domestic violence arena as well, but there's very often a lack of social support. There's some isolation. It's not unusual that survivors of domestic child sex trafficking and victims of domestic violence have, not always, but have some experience with poverty and lack of other opportunities in their community. And Justice McKee may talk more about it. I'll visit a little bit about it as far as the survivors of sex trafficking and the victims of domestic violence, unfortunately, are very often from marginalized communities, LGBTQI, Native American and Alaska Natives, Hispanic survivors and victims, and they don't always have the respect of their community, and when something happens, it's, oh well, they deserve it. So those are some of the similarities. There are some other societal factors and community factors, some of which I've already addressed, but I'll stop there.
Yeah, I would just add that I think it can be cyclical. You know, when I worked in child welfare for 16 years in the same community, I would see young people whose parents would be victims of domestic violence. And of course, then there was exposure to the youth, which appeared to make the youth, I think, more vulnerable. There's enough vulnerability there for a multitude of reasons, but it would expose them in ways that wasn't good. And then I think it just would allow for that outside influence to have greater access opportunities for the youth. And then as of course they progress into parents, you just sort of see it going round and round, and it gets really overwhelming when you're trying to think about how do we break that cycle and how do we actually help both the victims of domestic violence as well as preventing our youth from being trafficked. But I see it as very cyclical, as well as all of the things that were mentioned by Judge Romero. And I do think that it is sort of a forgotten population. You know, in this country, we talk a lot about how children are so incredibly important. And yet I can say that I've never seen that play out. I think it sounds great. It's a soundbite that is used in many, many fields. And yet the actual work and resources that are put into our youth are not what they should be if we're actually going to mean what we say. And so there are a lot of similarities, same for victims of or survivors of domestic violence. I think people sort of think like, well, that's their problem, or that doesn't apply to me. And unless they have had any sort of personal interaction with the issue in some capacity, there's not a whole lot of understanding or even feeling like there should be any investment. And I think that also goes especially for kids. I can remember one of my neighbors saying once, well, those are all just kids of color, right? I mean, that doesn't happen to our white children. And I thought, what? And I thought, first of all, why are you asking me that question? Which sort of showed me how sort of deaf they were in so many ways. As my husband is Hispanic, I am Native, and my my white neighbor is asking me that question, which there's so many things wrong with that, but also just the limited value that this individual put on children who were different than what his world was, let alone adult victims of violence.
I would just echo what Justice McKeague said. From my experience as a judge presiding over dependency cases, neglect and abuse cases, and also juvenile justice cases. And before that, before I was a judge, as a practicing attorney representing mostly women in domestic violence cases and in divorce, custody, those kinds of things. So I think it is cyclical. And if we don't start somewhere addressing the problem, we'll continue to have it. So I too rail and have often been heard to in a very inappropriate way sometimes criticize those who say, especially during what we're coming up now. I don't know how many of you are sick of listening to and watching political advertisements, but that mantra of our children are our future. It sounds great, but put your money where your mouth is and put your programs where your mouth is. And those children who are being abused, exploited, and otherwise maltreated, who can score 10 on the adverse childhood experiences today, will be the same folks who are being subjected, male and female alike, to domestic violence once they're in their adult years. And again, I think that one of the other areas that sort of really stinks, in my opinion, is people with disability, whether they're kids being exploited in domestic child sex trafficking, or adults whose partners or others in the community are exploiting them sexually, beating up on them, whatever it may be. That we've got to stop it somewhere. And my guess is the best place to do it for future generations, if indeed children are our future, is when we see them in juvenile justice cases and in dependency cases. One of the other areas that I think is a common factor, and my male colleagues or those listening who are of the male persuasion don't want to hear this, but that whole notion of male privilege that is rampant in our society and has been part of the US culture, that is taught, by the way, not something that is inherent to males who think that somehow or another they're privileged, that they have the right to demand, that they have the right to say, I'm the boss, I'm the king of my castle, you do as I say. And that includes fathers who tell their young daughters and their young men, young children, young males, you know, I'm the boss. I mean, they're teaching them how to be part of that male dominance, that male privilege that is part of this cycle that we don't talk about very often. But unfortunately, the studies that have been done, especially internationally, not so much in the United States, but there are some of those studies that originate from academic studies here in our country. But you know, male privilege, male dominance is one of the other contributing factors to domestic child sex trafficking and domestic violence.
Thank you both. And you had touched, I think, a little bit on some of the underlying, but when the council talks about domestic violence dynamics and we talk about power and control, that's a common theme of our presentations. And maybe you can talk a little bit about that power and control dynamic and how that works a little differently with domestic child sex trafficking.
With domestic child sex trafficking, you know, part of the power and control is achieved in any number of ways. You know, we talk a lot in the training that we do with domestic child sex trafficking about the different kind of exploiters, those who sell kids, because those who buy kids are another brand of exploiters, but I won't talk about them right now. But those who groom them and recruit them into their stable, if you will, do so with charm, with promises of, you know, I'm sorry you're being mistreated at home. I'll, you know, come with me and I'll, you know, you'll be fine. I respect you, only to turn them out, as the term goes, into the life of being forced to sell themselves for sex. Similarly, in domestic violence, that and I heard about it very distinctly in a real life case where this particular young man was in his church group, led a Bible study, was presented a very caring and very compassionate guy, and basically, you know, courted a young lady who had been divorced, had a couple of kids, and it took a long time, but they eventually got married. She trusted him, the kids loved him, and supposedly behind closed doors, after this great presentation of them being a happy family, gave the kids a puppy. And the kids were, you know, held the puppy and cooed over it and thanked him. And then he took the puppy away from them, threw it on the floor and stomped it to death. Says, from now on, if you don't do what I tell you to, this will happen to you. What a graphic example of tormenting, striking fear for the purpose of demanding that they yield to his every wish, his every demand, and that nothing that happens in the house gets told outside of the house. It's their secret. And if you say anything, you'll pay the price, just like the puppy did. So it's a means of demanding and getting from them the response that they want. In domestic child sex trafficking, very often the exploiter, the seller, the pimp, for lack of a better term, will say, I know you have a little brother. I know you have a mom. I know where they live. If you don't do what I tell you to, I'm going to kill them. Or another way, if you don't do what I tell you to do and you don't bring in the quota that's assigned to you, I'll kill you. And all kinds of realities and stages, you know, staged proceedings where they and their gang of traffickers will at least either kill someone, hurt them badly, or make the the survivor believe that they're next if they don't obey. So it's anything from withholding necessities to actual outright physical violence and threats of death as a means of controlling.
Yeah, and it's a level of sophisticated manipulation that I think is foreign to most people. And so I think that makes it an even additional layer where it's really hard for people to understand. I recall a time when I was a county attorney and listening to a victim of profound domestic violence, and at 25, not having the sophistication in my life experience or in my work experience to understand how that could happen. And she did such an incredible way of explaining it to the audience, including myself, which was just sort of this incremental brainwashing that occurs over time, that starting out as a young, beautiful, confident woman who could have never seen herself in that situation, and how she met the man of her dreams. And then how it just started so slowly, and that there was well, I'm never going to accept anyone talking to me like that. And they would start with the simple insults. And then when that became comfortable and just sort of the normal way of life, how that always was expanding, until she said she wakes up one day and she finds not only herself, but her child has now been killed by this individual. And she has physically and mentally transformed from the years of abuse that she had taken, and sort of like, how did she find herself there? And then having to go back and unwind sort of all of that incremental brainwashing that occurs. And if you think about that, and then you throw children in who don't have the capacity, the mental capacity, to be able to hopefully sort of ward off or fight off that sort of level of sophistication in manipulation, that just adds layers to the complexity of the issue. And now with the pandemic, and of course, we have always had this, what I consider to be an incredible ability for predators to access our kids through social media and through the devices. I think it's made it so much worse, and we aren't even going to know or appreciate how bad it's gotten for more time to come. And it's allowed for a whole new level of victims that perhaps were not as easily accessible, because they can attack pretty much anybody who's sitting in their bedrooms. And that includes children who have parents who are really fully capable and paying close attention, just always thinking, well, that's not going to happen to my child because, I've got this great relationship with my husband and I'm very educated. And yet we know that is happening in many, many homes. And I worry about what it's going to look like as the level of trauma that children have been exposed to, what that will mean as they enter adulthood. And take that complicated with our survivors of domestic violence, who we know who have suffered even greater during the time of the pandemic.
Justice McKeague brought up earlier the myth or the misconception that there are certain classes of families and kids to whom these atrocities don't happen. I want to be real clear that victims, survivors of sex trafficking, those who are entrapped into that servanthood, come in, from all economic classes, come from all ethnicities, and from parents who are educated and have very high-profile jobs. One of the young ladies that I met not long ago was actually being trafficked while still living at home. She would leave to go to school. She would stay late to study with her friends, and all the while she was being trafficked. And her parents, who were, very loving, caring, intact family, never had a clue this was going on. Similarly, with survivors of domestic violence, we tend to think that only happens to a certain class of people. It happens to anyone and everyone that we would least suspect of being victimized, brutalized in this fashion. One of the things that came to mind as we were preparing for this is how many years ago, when I was a brand new attorney back in several centuries ago, the notion of some men who would say, and some of my friends would say, I don't have any sympathy for a woman who gets beat the second time. She ought to just leave. And we hear that even today, decades later, and we hear that from no less than judges sometimes with regard to victims of domestic violence. Hopefully they don't say it from the bench, but behind closed doors in chambers, they've been heard to utter those things. Similarly, with survivors of human traffic, they say, wait a minute, she wasn't chained to the bed, she wasn't handcuffed, she's out on making dates and meeting people in hotels and selling her body. Why doesn't she just leave? This whole idea of being emotionally, psychologically enslaved is very real. The notion of being, that trauma bond, if you will, is something that's very real. And yet, for those of us who've maybe never been subjected to that, can say that's hogwash. You can leave anytime you want to. With victims of domestic violence, we should never tell them when to leave. They know best when it's safe to leave. And unfortunately, many well-meaning counselors, defense attorneys, attorneys who represent women, and even clergy will tell them either you can't leave because he is the head of the household and you would be dishonoring him if you left. You just have to buck up and deal with it, or you need to leave. The woman, the victim, just like the survivor of sex trafficking, knows when it is the best time to leave. All of the studies and research that we know with regard to domestic violence is that leaving is the highest level presents the highest level of lethality, unless that's planned and orchestrated well and left up to the victim to decide when to leave. We have no clue when it's the safest to leave. And I would just punctuate that by saying none of us, no matter how educated, how experienced we are experts in this arena. The victims are the experts in their own environment and their own experience, just like the survivors of sex trafficking, child sex trafficking are the experts. We don't listen to them enough. We don't give them enough of a voice for us to learn what we ought to know better.
Well, and thank you. And as mentioning the victims in particular, I did want to turn us to how these dynamics regarding child sex trafficking and domestic violence also relate to the crisis of missing and murdered Indigenous peoples that we are facing in the United States.
Yeah, I'm glad that you brought that up because, we know that Native women, 1 in 3 experience either physical or sexual assault in their lifetime. And of course, the question that we have asked in the Indian community is, why is that happening to us at these rates? And of course, when you're trying to have that discussion, one of the very first questions is, well, what is the data other than the 1 in 3? Well, we don't have good data. And part of that is with the jurisdictional complexities between state courts and Indigenous nations or tribal nations, having the dual or solo jurisdiction. It's also all of the different intersection of law enforcement agencies, whether it's federal, whether it's tribal, whether it's state, whether it's local, trying to collect that information into something that is meaningful so that there can be a good conversation at a state level, and more importantly, I think even at a national level, is one of the main problems. And so you take all of that and then you add what I think are just some things about my community that make us more vulnerable, which is perhaps some of the isolation that occurs in our remote areas. The place that I grew up was 90, it's now 95 people, according to the latest census. It was 106. But it certainly is a very remote part of the state. It was 40 miles to go to a grocery store, and it was 30 miles to go to school. And there was a lot of freedom as a child. And I was lucky to have 2 very healthy parents who, drove around town to check and see where I was and who I was talking to. But with that isolation comes sort of an element of individuals who seek out those areas for multiple reasons, including we know that when the whole issue came down about the Catholic Church, well, I looked at priests who were placed in those missions in those sorts of remote areas. Well, that was many of the predators. And that also goes with sort of a criminal element that might try to disappear into some of these remote areas because there is not the law enforcement presence that perhaps there is elsewhere. I look at I think many people think of Indian people, it's sort of their problem. We consider ourselves sort of this invisible group of people who have been long forgotten. It is rare in any sort of a conversation that I will have that impacts Indian people where we are remembered that we are an important part of that conversation. In fact, the majority of our history has been outsiders telling my community how it should be done or what should be important or what the rules are or taking away. And I don't know if it's because I would say that my community is a somewhat quiet community and passive. People consider us as not having a lot of political clout. And so therefore that lessens the need, perhaps I think that some people in the policy making decisions think that they don't necessarily have to listen to us because we're not going to have any sort of influence. So there's all kinds of issues that I think add to the problem. And many times when I was mentioning the other day at a training, it was, okay, so if I go on the reservation, I will see posters, I will see media that will talk about youth that are missing or Native women that are missing. But if I go outside the boundaries of the reservation, even though we are citizens of the United States and citizens of our state, there is no sort of media acknowledgement or any assistance in looking for individuals. So it does feel like we are invisible, and it has gotten national attention, and you like to hope that it's just not because we're popular at the moment, but we need to take advantage when we can to try to get partners. And I think that the council has been really good in remembering tribal peoples and partnering with the tribal judges and the organizations that we have issues in common that we all need to work together on. And that includes the missing and murdered adult women, but also our kids who are disappearing at a rate that is alarming.
Again, I'm kind of the advocate for the males as well, in that male Indian people, Alaska Natives, go missing as well. Certainly not to the rate that women are going missing, but it's happening to all Native people. And again, I think it's a problem that is ignored by the larger community. I think that it's complex. I think to some measure, unless we talk about the history of Indian people in our country, in our individual states, we can't even begin to relate to the notion of genocide, of the attitudes towards Indian people. I grew up in northwestern New Mexico, which is very close to the Navajo Nation, and I recall as a young high school kid, junior high kid, back when they had junior high instead of middle school, all of the derogatory things that were said about, our neighbors to the west. And to the north of us, there's another tribal community, the two divisions of the Ute people. And the local business owners loved it at the end of the month when the population of my little community grew, geometrically when they came in to spend their money. But the rest of the time, they were undesirables. They were, all alcoholics. They were all ignorant people. What a shame to categorize folks as a group rather than value who they are as individuals. I think that to understand, for me in New Mexico, my home state, born and raised here and worked here all my life, unless those of us who practice in this state, those of us who work with kids, who work with adults who are working with people, unless we understand the history of our tribal and Pueblo communities in the state, we cannot begin to understand the expertise that they bring to the table and to, as Justice McKeague said, not make policies, not make laws without their input when those laws impact them directly. For any number of reasons, the Indian Child Welfare Act is under attack federally. Will be heard at the next session of the next term of the U.S. Supreme Court, the challenge to the Indian Child Welfare Act. New Mexico, for 2 years now and successful this year, had worked on implementing our own statewide equivalent of the Indian Child Welfare Act. It did pass this year, and it is the Indian Family Protection Act. And without that in place, should the Supreme Court decide to find that ICWA, the Indian Child Welfare Act, is unconstitutional, children and their families and their tribes will be unprotected as they have since 1978, to the extent that the law was implemented, because we know that in some communities, ICWA was just one of those things that was a problem to deal with, but let's move on and not really implement it in the spirit that it was enacted. That's another arena that I think people would serve themselves well in reading the congressional history of how, those who testified leading up to the passage of the Indian Child Welfare Act in 1978. Horrendous stories told about what led to the passage of that act.
Thank you. Any further discussion about the overlap between the dynamics of domestic child sex trafficking and the missing and murdered crisis?
No, I really appreciate the comments by Judge Romero. It's not often that I get to hear that level of understanding from some of my colleagues. So I really appreciate that, because I do think it's incredibly important. It cannot just be left to those of us who are Native, which sadly happens a lot. We get tapped to do anything and everything that has to do with Indian people. And I think that happens to other communities of color and leaders who are in those communities. And what happens then is sometimes we just get really overextended. And I always say that we need allies. So it's really a breath of fresh air to hear someone like Judge Romero have that level of understanding. So miigwech to you, Judge Romero. I really appreciate your comments.
Well, thank you. And Justice McKeague, I appreciate you being the voice of Indian people as well. You're in a very strategic place on the Supreme Court, but also in so many other areas that I know you speak at and teach. And I've been blessed by hearing you speak several different times on this and other subjects. So you're a welcome resource to our greater understanding of how we all can function better. And ultimately, as juvenile and family court judges, be part of the solution on better serving families and children who come before us, of whatever ethnicity or national origin they might be. I do want to add that the National Council, and Justice McKeague alluded to it already, but has a very close working relationship with the National American Indian Court Judges Association and a state tribal partnership committee that is doing a lot of work to educate us all, to bring us to a better understanding, along with the membership judges and other court professionals who work in the arena of juvenile and family courts. I would invite you to look at some of the work that has been done that's on our website. I think there's some resource material that's available to the participants today. One is a PDF that Justice McKeague and her crew presented last week at a webinar, "We're Not Invisible: Improving Awareness of Human Trafficking Issues in Indigenous Communities." And then the council some time ago did a technical assistance bulletin on creating a human trafficking strategic plan that actually focuses on tribal communities, not just the communities outside of our tribal nations. And one of the interesting data points that came out in your training last week, Justice McKeague, was the percentage of women, Native women, who actually don't live on the reservation, as is a common myth, but actually live in urban communities, that amplifies and complicates the jurisdictional issues that you were talking about earlier, and that was very well presented in that webinar as well.
Thank you. Jenny is adding the resources that Judge Romero referenced into the chat for your download if you would like to see them. You can also find some of those resources on the council's website. So our next question for discussion is, if you had to think of your priority for what should judges know about the dynamics of domestic child sex trafficking and domestic violence, what would you want those judges to know?
One of the things that is important, I believe, is that active and compassionate listening is critical. Judges are trained as lawyers, and unfortunately, we see it in the courtroom all the time, where instead of paying attention to what's being said at the moment, attorneys are thinking about the next question they're going to ask or the next point they're going to make. Sadly, we judges fall into the same category sometimes. Active and compassionate listening means making eye contact, not crossing your arms and looking off into the ceiling, but also being mindful of the dynamics of what's going on in the courtroom. Who is in the courtroom? You're not going to know that unless you're making eye contact, not just with a victim or a survivor, but with everyone else who's in the courtroom, and ensuring that safety is first and foremost for those who are involved in your courtroom. That can't happen unless we are compassionate in the way we deal with folks. And if we listen, that's supposed to be one of the greatest tools that we judges have, is actively listening and not just pretending like we're listening.
Yeah, and I think it's really important that we don't just sit. I mean, it's changed now, obviously, with the pandemic and a lot of virtual court hearings, but that we also don't just sit in our chambers or in our offices. I tell you, some of the best learning that can happen, I think, is when you go out into the community and have conversations. We did that as part of a project where we spoke to abusers, adult male abusers, who were very, very chatty, but also gave a lot of really good information as it relates to understanding sort of how they think and how they access the victims or what they look for. And that the same goes for other predators. A lot can be learned that way, as well as just being an active part of your community, and not perhaps just a part that you feel most comfortable with, pushing ourselves outside of that comfort zone. I would say that the most relevant experience that I have that has helped me, I think, be a better judge on the trial court and then hopefully on the Supreme Court, is my life experience. Going home to the reservation, or everyone that I know around me who frankly has either been on the wrong side of the criminal justice system or who has been a victim in some way, shape, or form, and knowing what that can be like, but also knowing that I don't know everything. I think Judge Romero's comments about paying attention to what happens in the courtroom is incredibly important, because using all of our senses, even on the Supreme Court, I remember there was an argument that was happening, and I was watching the people that were in the courtroom because it was a hot emotional issue, and normally you don't get so much of that at the appellate level, but I was watching the two parties, and it really had an influence on how I thought about the case, just because I was picking up the different dynamics. And my colleagues, I said, "Oh, did you notice X, Y, and Z?" And they were oblivious. But that's because they had not been trial judges, and so they weren't used to watching a courtroom and everything that goes on in it, including who comes in, who goes out, facial gestures. That, a look can tell you a lot. You can't assume that but it certainly can inform you if you need to ask different questions, or sort of understanding what our limitations are. And more importantly for me, checking myself, because I remember there was a time where we were talking about early case management in family cases. And I all of a sudden it just dawned on me one day that the speech or the words that I was using when I first met people, that I could have been actually empowering an abuser just by the language that I was using, which was, you should be solving these problems yourself. I'm thinking, oh my gosh, I got to be more mindful that just because it isn't on the document, which we know many, many times it's not, or there isn't information within the petition or what have you, that we just don't know the parties who are coming before us. And so I think we have to be very mindful that we could be saying something that could be really detrimental, and try to think of things that we could say that could actually have that positive effect rather than the negative effect, and not be empowering those who perhaps already have been manipulating the power that they have in the relationship, whether that be trafficking youth or whether it be survivors of domestic violence.
One of the things that came to mind as Justice McKeague was sharing is that whole concept of implicit bias. We all have those biases. We all bring them to the bench. We're supposed to be able to turn that stuff off and be the neutral fact finder, determiner, the one who determines the law, apply the law to the facts and make a decision. But we need to be honest with ourselves. We have biases. We have our own experiences that get triggered sometimes, our own trauma. And if we don't plan ahead of a hearing to deal with those things, and check those things in the chambers and not bring them to the bench with us, we're going to be exploiters and perpetrators as well, unknowingly and unwittingly. So it's important that we be mindful of those biases that we bring to the bench. We're not a blank slate. We're human beings as well, contrary to some opinions that some attorneys have and some litigants have. But we need to be aware of those things. I think that it's also important that we take to heart what Justice McKeague just said about getting off the bench, out of the chambers and into the community. My mentor, the judge who passed away recently, who encouraged me to seek the trial court bench, essentially told me one time, being a children's court judge is about 20% bench time and 90% community time. And your own court community, understanding the folks who work in the building and what they bring to the table, their own fears and likes and dislikes, but very importantly, the community that you live in. And you can't get a real feel for that, as Justice McKeague already said, unless you get off the bench and get out and meet those folks that you otherwise see in your courtroom. And some folks have some ethical concerns about that. Well, what if I go to a community meeting and grandpa comes up and says, oh, my son has a hearing before you next week? It's easy. It may not seem easy, but say, I understand, I really can't talk to you about the case. Thank you for being at this meeting today. I'm anxious to hear what else is going to be presented. But if I talk to you about the case, I need to remove myself from the case and another judge will be assigned. So don't be afraid because ethical considerations scare you away from, compromising your role. Get out and learn from those people. Again, as I mentioned earlier, they are the experts in their community and in their situation, and we can learn a lot from them by being out and hearing them speak. They can learn a lot about our roles too. It's not as simple as calling balls and strikes, certainly not in juvenile and family court.
Well, thank you both. And I think you both alluded to part of this, but in terms of what judges should know about the dynamics, you talk a little bit about where the judges are likely to see cases that involve domestic child sex trafficking and domestic violence. They're going to appear to you as a DCST case, or as always as a case for a protective order or something specifically mentioning domestic violence.
The research that's been done on the issue of domestic child sex trafficking is that it can happen anywhere to anyone, and that we need to first of all not look for the perfect or the standard B-flat survivor of sex trafficking. So in my experience, as a trial court judge in dependency and juvenile justice, unless we ask the questions, unless we subscribe to the notion that we judges are supposed to ask questions, not just sit up on the bench looking, looking like we know everything. Some kids will tell you, by the way, you judges are very impersonal. You sit up there and we're afraid of you because we don't know what to say or what to ask. We need to ask questions. And in dependency cases, if you have a child who is running away, male or female, from their placement, there may be more to that than just meets the eye. Ask the questions, charge the child welfare agency and the child's attorney or guardian ad litem to look into that more. In juvenile justice, boys who seem to be the bad guys sometimes when it is alleged they committed a delinquent act, they very often are victims themselves. To quote a former now retired judge who used to say, hurt people hurt people. So, young men who are charged with sexual assault, who are charged with, battery, whatever it may be, let's not be quick to criminalize their behavior, but ask and look beneath the surface. Why are they doing what they're doing? Again, as someone said, we should be less quick about asking the question, what did you do? And at least parenthetically ask, what has happened to you? Where did you come from? What's your background? I would, in dependency cases, one of the things that people used to look at me like I was crazy when I would ask a kiddo or their attorney, do you have a dog or a cat? Do you have a pet? And amazing how many times they would answer yes, and they wanted to see their dog more than they wanted to see their parents or their sibling. Those other creatures in their lives very often are the one source of support that they have. Similarly, when we ask about the kid that keeps running away, well, where would you like to be placed? Who would you be safe with? Theoretically, the child welfare agency has already asked that, but maybe they didn't tell them. Again, let's hear their voices, give them an opportunity to speak and to educate us on what they have expertise in, because we don't have that expertise.
Yeah, and I think that the answer to that question is really we have to be looking for it or paying attention that it could appear in any of our courts. Everybody has it a little bit differently. In the larger jurisdictions, you might be in specialty courts. In the smaller jurisdictions, you're judges of general jurisdiction. But what is frustrating is when colleagues on the bench will think that it's only going to occur, well, I don't do juvenile court or dependency court. I don't do family court. I only do criminal court. Well, it very well could show up in criminal court. It could be in probate court. It could be in small claims court. I mean, and out in the community, I always say that, when I teach law students, we have these obligations as community members, which go well beyond just our professional role, whatever that may be. And for us, it's judges. Being a judge is not an easy job. I mean, you sort of have to call upon all of your senses, all of your common sense, as well as your knowledge of the law. But don't forget the other side of that. Sometimes it's like when they say, if you've got a gut feeling, to follow that gut feeling. And sometimes I think, try to just intellectualize something and take the feeling part of it out. And everybody processes those things differently. But I think we have to just really draw upon everything that we have and watch for it, no matter where it might be in the court, and not being afraid to go, well, I just got to stay in my lane because right now I am dealing with this felony and I can't look at anything else. Well, we're not doing anybody any good then, including when we're out in the community. And oftentimes people will say, well, I saw something and it made me feel uneasy, but I didn't think I should overstep because it's not my role. I'm not the parent, or it's not my child, or what have you. And I always get so frustrated because shouldn't we be caring about everyone that's out there, including, you look at sometimes on the media where you'll see a survivor of domestic violence and people are just staying around. They're doing absolutely nothing, not wanting to be involved. Just go upon your way and stay in your lane and mind your own business. And granted, it's harder for some than others, but it just seems to me that the courts can't handle this problem all on our own. And in fact, it's probably not even the best place for the issues to be addressed. And so I think we have to do a better job of sort of blowing the courtroom doors open and asking our communities to be much more involved and be partners in what are very serious and significant and complex issues. Because there are a lot of people who really just want to help and do the right thing, but we also have to sort of step outside of our comfort zone and invite that, and not just be so territorial or single-minded or siloing our services or the way that we handle court.
I agree. I think that we sometimes wear blinders as judges and ignore the fact that we live in a community. And some people will say, sort of a corollary to all politics is local. Well, all solutions to our problems are local as well. It begins at the community level. And as Justice McKeague said, we're all members of a community. We all go to nowadays with maybe some fear and trepidation to the grocery store, to church, wherever it may be, to my grandson's flag football game every Saturday or his soccer match. And that's where you meet the salt of the earth, if you will. That's where you have the opportunity to listen to what people say and to hear the concerns that they express. One of the novel, I think, positive trends that is going on is to not look at those who are the exploiters. And I mentioned earlier that buyers are exploiters as well. Perpetrators of domestic violence are human beings as well. And part of solving those issues is not criminalizing their behavior exclusively, but looking to programs that are aiming to assist those who did wrong to understand why it is what they did was wrong. Perpetrators education programs, buyers and even traffickers education programs that may be required as part of a court proceeding or may be voluntary. We need to, one of the best ways to, I think, address the domestic violence issue is to educate young men and boys on why that's not okay, that the culture we've grown up in that may condone that and maybe even encourage it is ancient and not valuable anymore. What does it mean to be a man in today's society is a lesson that as fathers and as grandfathers, as moms and grandmothers, our young men need to be learning, and also what our young girls and women need to learn from those with the experience of having lived life a little bit.
Thank you both. We have a few minutes left. And I wanted to address before we go the victims and the victim voice in the process. You both talked a little bit about demographics of victims and who may be affected most by domestic child sex trafficking and domestic violence. But what do you think the judges should know about the victims and the victim's voice in this process?
I think I've said it to the point of boring you all now. Victims are the experts. But privacy and safety are considerations as well. And sometimes they're not going to disclose, when we want to hear from the victims, it probably isn't going to be in the courtroom. That is a public place to some measure with people in there that we don't even know and that they may know or not know, those who may be pressuring them or keeping an eye out to make sure they don't say the wrong thing. So privacy and safety go hand in hand with promoting a venue, a place where voices can be heard. And it's generally not going to be the judge, although it can be. But part of what I learned a long time ago was that a trial judge's best tool is a recess. As Judge McKeague said earlier, if you get that sense that something is going on, you observe the dynamics of what's going on in a courtroom, or you see a witness who is also a survivor, starting to get emotional or triggered and unable to really respond, take a recess, give them a chance to deal with whatever it is that's bothering them. Also give me a chance as the judge to not lose it. One of my colleagues has on her bench a couple of donkey caricatures, and she says that's to remind her not to be a jackass. And sometimes the recess that we can take helps us remember that we shouldn't be jackasses and say something we will regret later, or that we intimidate a survivor, a victim, or anyone else in the courtroom who could be triggered by what we say and what our mannerisms are.
And I always say that compassion and empathy are incredibly important. And oftentimes we get deep into the finishing our calendar and trying to do all the efficiencies that we must do in order to do our job. But we cannot forget that people are people along the way, and those that are survivors are important contributors to our communities. And we shouldn't be just treating them, especially kids and survivors, but they're not throwaways. And far too often, I think we as a society at its greatest and broadest point treat them as such. And sometimes just letting individuals know that there is somebody out there who acknowledges them and cares about them can be just perhaps that first seed that helps inspire them to be able to stand up for themselves or seek out the assistance that they need. And those are incredible moments and incredible opportunities that not everybody has, but that I think many times we have as judges. And so we shouldn't forget about taking advantage of those opportunities.
Well, thank you both. We do have moments left, so if anyone has any questions or would like to present anything into the chat, please feel free. But I know that might have to take a moment to talk about TA or training that you are aware of that is regarding domestic child sex trafficking. We've mentioned the National Council's Domestic Child Sex Trafficking Judicial Institute. Judge Romero has served as faculty. The council has also other resources that have been made available in the chat that offer some technical assistance bulletins and other information about the issue and the dynamics that we've discussed a little bit here. And looks like we've got a comment in the chat. So I wish that judges would begin to recognize emotional and verbal abuse as being detrimental to families.
Yeah,
Go ahead, Justice.
Yeah, I was just going to say it's a really good point. I think that is something that we want our colleagues to remember, that when you think of domestic violence in its and at its core, it's not always just that somebody's going to show up with a bruise in your courtroom. Oftentimes the emotional abuse is much more complex and harder to address than the actual physical assault. So it's a very good reminder.
In the dependency world as well, and even in juvenile justice, too often I heard, the facts being that, dad and mom told their son or their daughter, "You're stupid. I wish we'd never had you. You're never going to amount to anything." And in the domestic violence context, kids hearing one of the adults say to the other, you're a piece of trash, you should get out of my house and never be around here anymore. Kids learn from all that stuff. Those who are victimized by that emotional and verbal abuse sometimes give it back, sometimes they don't, and it's just as harmful. My wife used to have, when our kids were younger, I'm not sure where it went, but on our refrigerator, something that said something like, "Words can hurt as hard as a fist." And that's a stark reminder that what we say and how we behave ourselves can be as damaging and as hurtful as that fist in somebody's face, or that something that's thrown at someone and you hit them. So great point. Ms. Davis, thank you for bringing that up.
We've had one more comment in the chat that there are many trainings offered to judges and court professionals, but how do you move from training to implementation? You constantly hear about judges who look only for physical violence and DV cases, or judges who criminalize minors for prostitution and related offenses. What role do judges play in holding each other accountable and ensuring that there is some degree of consistency in response and understanding these cases?
Inviting them to trainings or presenting their training yourself. You know, in the court that I spent 17 and a half years in, there were very few judges. You know, right now there are 4. Most of the time there were only 2 or 3. And, you know, someone would say, you know, can we have a brown bag lunch where the 4 of us can get together, or the 3 of us, and talk about something and just share your experience, all the way to having a quarterly brown bag lunch or whatever it is, and inviting the attorneys, the judges, and even, you know, probation or the child welfare workers to present a training that addresses these issues. But saying nothing is not acceptable. We have to talk about these things.
And I also would just add, find your champion, because you do have to have one who's going to move the bureaucracies in a way that's going to be helpful to implementing actual change. And that can be, you need champions within the court, but also champions outside of the court. Sometimes community partners can be your loudest voice to help you accomplish what it is that you are trying to accomplish.
But the second part of that comment was not only training, but implementing. And that, you know, that's a harder nut to crack, I think, because we all know we go to trainings, we get all amped up, we go home on Friday, and then Monday life takes over. And that whole process of implementing gets kind of tossed to the side. We need to have a plan. We need to write it down on how we're going to implement the things we've learned, not just say, wow, that was a great conference. I learned a lot of great stuff.
Well, thank you both so much for your time and attention to this. We are out of time. And I thank you to our participants, as well as Justice McKeague and Judge Romero. Thank you so much.
Thank you all.